Just to begin, if you don't mind introducing yourself, and then we can discuss the article Marx in Algiers that you wrote.
Yeah, my own approach to Marx and Marxism is deeply shaped by my training in revolutionary operaism since the end of the 70s, when I was a kid and I started to be politically active. But then, of course, many things happened and they influenced also my reading of Marx. To put it very shortly, I think the encounter with migration in Italy and in Europe was particularly important in this respect because it led me to kind of provincialize the reading of Marx that emerged out of the development of operaism, basically in Italy in the 1960s and 1970s. And then, I engaged in conversations with anti-colonial, post-colonial thinkers in many parts of the world, and this also played a role, of course. And maybe I should mention also my work with Brett Nielsen, an Australian friend and comrade, that has been particularly important for me in the last 20 years. We wrote a couple of books together, and Marx figures prominently in both books, in the book on borders and in a book on, let's say, contemporary capitalism, although it's a bit generic.
Yeah, so to get into the article in particular, so you discuss a little bit at the beginning that you're not particularly interested in retelling the history of why Marx was in Algiers, but more in how Marxist thoughts emerged in the South and in the East. And you talk about, you have a reading particularly of Marx in his later years in 1880 to 1882, changing and sort of interpreting more multilinear, a more multilinear approach to the Weltgeschichte, and his reading of the development of capitalism in historical development. So if you don't mind sort of explaining a little bit more about this interpretation and how it relates, I think you make allusion to the debate about the universal in particular in post-colonial debates. So if you would explain a little bit more about it, how it relates, and also how it's related to historical development in the colonial situation, his letters to Vera Vasilich in Russia, and his commentary on Russia too. So any of these subjects, yeah.
Yes, of course. I mean, let me start by saying that Marx in Algiers was published as an article, but actually is the last chapter of a short book I published on Marx. And so it's a kind of attempt to take stock of an analysis of Marx that follows the thread of the problematic of what we call today production of subjectivity. And second introductory remark is that the title is also a kind of a reference to a very important article that was published in the 1960s by Mario Tronti, and that was titled Lenin in England. That article was particularly important in the development of autonomous Marxism in Italy, and it particularly shaped the operaist view of tendency, a very important notion in Marx and in autonomist Marxism. So that text is an attempt to engage in a critical and in a way self-critical conversation with a specific understanding of capitalist development, which is shaped by a certain linearity and by the idea that there is always a most advanced point in the development of capitalism, and that most advanced point is the one in which revolution must be played out. That was kind of hypothesis in the mid-1960s that was polemical with respect to third worldism. So to put it shortly, while you had a lot of people who said the chance for socialist revolution must be looked for in the third world, in places like Algeria or Vietnam, Mario Tronti said the opposite is true. The real chance for revolution is there where capitalism is most advanced. And why? Because the very fact that capitalism is most advanced corresponds to the fact that workers' struggles are very strong, you know, because it is worker struggles that drives capitalist development. So basically, in my article, I challenge this view, but I do that not in a simple way. I try to retain something of the operaist paradigm. And this something is the fact that there is a tendency of development in capitalism, and that this tendency of development translates in quite different ways onto different material contexts. And so it is from this point of view that I engage in a conversation with many thinkers who have spoken of a multilinear understanding of the history of capitalism, particularly in the late Marx, but according to some people, already in the Grundrisse. So from the point of view of this reading of Marx, I try to reframe a whole set of questions, including the very general question of the universal and of the relation between abstract and concrete, you know, because to put it quickly, I argue that the translation, the moment of translation of the abstract onto the concrete always implies important mutations with the way in which the abstract, which means the rule of capital, constructs its own history. So from this point of view, I have in particular a discussion with Dipesh Chakrabarty, with quite famous chapter of Provincializing Europe, when it talks, where it talks about the two histories of capital. And well, I think I reframe that kind of analytical model in a way that is not necessarily close to the one Chakrabarty had in mind. And I kind of emphasize the moment of clash between these two histories, you know, the one that is shaped by real abstraction as a basic code of capital, and the one that is shaped by the translation of real abstraction onto different material contexts. Real abstraction also means real abstract labor. And the concept of abstract labor is kind of central in the short book I wrote and I was mentioning before. And of course, this reflection upon abstract labor has important implications for the way in which we imagine and construct today the other of capital. Or if you prefer, the revolutionary subject. I am convinced that in most Western capitalism, and in particular in autonomous Marxism, there was a tendency to imagine the working class in very abstract terms, as a kind of reversal of the progress of abstraction that is inherent to capital. And I try to introduce the moment of translation, as I was explaining before, also in the understanding of the composition of labor. So that living labor becomes constitutively characterized by a deep heterogeneity, crisscrossed by difference, and this raises, of course, important challenges for the way in which we understand the concept of class that is also at stake in my work.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm also curious about, you frequently reference Marx's use of the term Grenze. So you talk about, capital encountering borders and encountering non-capitalist space. So if you could talk a little bit more about that in the construction of the world market.
Yes, this is for me a very important point, and it is also a very important point. I must underscore that in the work I do with Brett Nilsson, we kind of elaborate on a short passage that you find in the Grundrisse, where Marx says, on the one hand, that the constitution of the world market is immediately given with the concept of capital. And on the other hand, the moment of the encounter with the limit is constitutive of the operations of capital. And Marx says capital encounters limits in its development, and it turns them onto obstacles to be overcome. So I have very much emphasized this point, and I have argued that we should take this moment of the encounter with the limit as a moment that generates specific conflicts and antagonism in the history and in the present of capitalism. This is, of course, not that original. Maybe what is peculiar is my emphasis on the fact that the word, the German word that Marx uses for limit, which means Grenze, is also the word that denotes geopolitical borders. This is maybe a bit original, but just think of Rosa Luxemburg, her 1913 book on the accumulation of capital. You can find the same conceptual angle, and as far as I'm concerned, I think that this point continues to be particularly important today because it shows that the constitution of the world market is never given. Yet there is definitely a difference with Rosa Luxemburg, because Rosa Luxemburg was convinced that capital needed literal outsides. And once all the world will become capitalist, Rosa Luxemburg says, capitalism will be over. But this did not happen, as we know. And so what I think, what I foreshadow in that piece, but then I elaborated more with Brett in the politics of operations on the point, is that we have to reframe the very notion of outside. And we have to take seriously also the fact that capitalism or capital may produce its own outsides, may produce the limits that it then turns onto obstacles to be overcome, because this is a very important moment in the process of valorization, And so we are confronted today with the multiplication of, let's say, quote and unquote, artificial outside. And so I think this is, again, important also for the topics that I was mentioning before, because in this moment of, let's say, so metaphorically, encounter with the limit, capital is always confronted with a problem of translation, again, in metaphorical sense, of course, So on the one hand, you have an abstract structure again, but on the other hand, you have this multiplication of encounters that are also always, at least in a certain sense, clashes. With limits, with outsides. And this moment of encounter with the limit generates heterogeneity, if you understand what I mean with this word. I think it's an important point, because the idea that capital is basically a homogenizing power is a very widespread idea. You find it, of course, in the Manifesto 1848, but you find it again and again also in contemporary debates. Just to think of Vivek Chiba's book on post-colonial studies, or subaltern studies. So I think there is a need to reframe the relation between homogeneity and heterogeneity. And of course, I mean, these are abstract concepts, but it is easy to operationalize them and to make them very, very concrete, particularly as far as the question of the composition of living labor is concerned. And this question, is the most important one for me.
And I wonder with that, if you don't mind, you referenced the article, of course, primitive accumulation, and talk about the relation of this between the universal moment of capital and its heterogeneity. You referenced Marx's letter to the Russian editors, where he says not to draw a generic study from a specific moment in Western Europe. So if you can explain more about how it relates for the concept of primitive accumulation.
Yes, primitive accumulation is a very important question. In my own work, I wrote a long essay on that topic some 15 years ago that has been a kind of generative essay, meaning that it has helped me to frame a whole set of questions. And again, I mean, your question leads me back to what I was saying before. It is true that Marx, in his late years, was kind of revising his earlier view of primitive accumulation. The letters and the drafts of letters that he wrote in his conversation with Russian revolutionaries in his last years are symptomatic of that. You know, I'm convinced that there has been a bit of overemphasis on those letters and drafts of letters in the last years, you know, particularly in the US debate. Some thinkers, friends, have come up with an interpretation of Marx as a kind of communitarian thinker that I don't think is particularly consistent. But above all, you know, I think it is more important to rescue this moment of confusion in the late Marx. And this will to go beyond his own limits. You know, this is really something that I find powerful. And at the same time, you don't find a systematic alternative to the picture of primitive accumulation, in particular, that he provided in Capital Volume 1. But this will to go beyond his limits, his own limits, is very important. And he definitely understood that, in a way, his gaze had been provincial, you know. He was looking now well beyond Europe, you know. He always did so, at least since he started to write articles for the New York Daily Tribune, you know, in the early 1850s. But after publishing Capital Volume 1, he intensified this kind of awareness of the fact that capital was really, and not only conceptually, a world system. And from this point of view, it was definitely considering other paths, other possibilities of development of capitalism. And Russia, that was very important to Marx in the last years, as we know, provided him with kind of testing field, you know, and the kind of multilinear understanding of the history of capitalism that we were discussing before is again tested precisely in his writings on Russia. But consider the fact that Marx, that was already quite old, he was exhausted, he had a lot of family tragedies, he was sick, and he starts to study Russian. You know, that's something that really strikes me, and I tended to understand that this as part of an attempt to widen his gaze. And while he widens his gaze, he sees, of course, things that are not compatible with the kind of framework that he forged in Capital Volume 1.
Right, and in doing that, you quote from Katsky, the manuscripts that are posthumously published by Katsky, Theories of Surplus Value. It is only foreign trade, the development of the market to a world market, which causes money to develop into world money and abstract labor into social labor. I wonder if you can speak a little bit more about this transformation in the emergence of the world market from abstract labor into social labor, and how that relates to, you were mentioning a bit about real abstraction earlier.
Yeah. I mean, this is a question that leads me again to pick up on something I was already mentioning, because at stake in that quote is precisely the relation between the abstract and the concrete. Let me put it in this philosophically very simple way. I think that the world market, this is a point I discussed with many friends, in Marx is a full-fledged concept. You know, it's not only the geographical framework of the development of capitalism. It is really a concept, and that quote is particularly relevant from this point of view, because in a way, in that quote, you can imagine that the world market works like an abstract matrix. And so on the one hand, you have this kind of abstract matrix that can only exist at the level of the world market. On the other hand, you have the empirical, quote and unquote, empirical organization, articulation of the world market, that of course differs also profoundly, I mean, from conjuncture to conjuncture. But I think it is important to make this distinction. You know, if you think of the theory of the hegemonic cycle developed by world system theory scholars like Immanuel Wallerstein, and in particular Giovanni Arrighi, I mean, you can say that that theory is located at the level of the concrete articulation and organization of the world market. While the world market as an abstract matrix continues to work, in a way crosses the history of capitalism, and among other things allows the continuous translation of abstract labor onto social labor. What does it mean? Of course, abstract labor has a specific meaning in Marx. It is, to put it with Deepesh Chakrabarty, the way in which capital compels us to see the world. You know. It is more concretely the commodity form that is inscribed onto living labor or labor power. They are not the same, but so in order to make this inscription possible, you need again a process that I call translation. I mean, and I hope you understand what I mean. This process of translation does not happen in the same way everywhere in the world. And even, you know, in a single city, it happens in very different ways. So what Marx says, what Marx suggests in that quote is that this process of translation that takes place every day in every city in the world, in every place in the world, is made possible by the world market. By the world market as a kind of matrix, as I was saying, and the same is true for money. So, you know, the two peculiar commodities that Marx describes in his work, labor power and money, are predicated upon the working of the world market. This is the way in which I understand the world market as a concept. And it may sound abstract, but if you follow me, then you are compelled to take seriously the element of heterogeneity that deserves detailed investigation in not an abstract way.
Right, and from this, I'm curious to examine a little bit further the political conclusions you take from this. So you were mentioning earlier Mario Chanti and Lenin in England, and to what extent do you think you're still asserting a level of agreement with Appareismo, but at the same time criticizing some aspects of it that may be focused on a working class in Europe, perhaps, and in this you seek to perhaps like include the global South to an extent within the revolutionary potential throughout the world.
Oh yes, of course. I mean, over the last 20 years, I've been traveling and working with friends and comrades based in many parts of the so-called global South, particularly in India and in Latin America. So I am definitely aware of the potentialities that nowadays we can find and we could always find in the so-called global South. You know, to put it shortly, the attempt I have been making over the last years, and the attempt I am making also today in front of the world, you know, is to work toward a new internationalism, a completely new internationalism. Completely new, first of all, because it cannot take as its constitutive basis the nation. While, of course, in the history of socialist and communist internationalism, the nation was the organizational basis of the international. You know? My idea, but we would need more time to expand on that, is that we really need today a new political discourse capable of giving expression to the reality of exploitation and to desires for liberation that exist in many parts of the world, while at the same time keeping open a space for the political expression of differences. You know, and needless to say, such a political discourse, such a political horizon, such a political imagination can only be a collective work, you know. And but to think of the situation today in Europe, in the world, with the war in Ukraine, you know, I was doing a kind of round table yesterday with Indian friends in Calcutta, and we were talking about Zimmerwald, the Zimmerwald conference in 1915. And we were trying, you know, because there are many people who say, let's organize a new Zimmerwald. Okay, let's do that, but it is not particularly easy, you know. At that time, there were organizations. There was the labor movement, although divided, etc. Today, everything is more elusive, scattered, you know. But at least we were starting to speak about how such a conference should look like today. So it is this kind of debates and discussions that we need to intensify and at the same time, we also need, let's say, exemplary actions, which means political experiments capable to be generalized, appropriated, translated again. But I feel a kind of sense of urgency today, particularly in front of the war, but I already felt such a sense also in front of the pandemic. So in this process, there are no, there is not the possibility that European thinkers or even organizations take the lead. Such a process must be an open process, and as far as I'm concerned, I think of the legacy of anti-colonial struggles as one of the driving forces of that.
Absolutely, and I definitely agree with you. And this would be sort of my last question, and it can be, I guess, quite a short one, but it is quite complicated. But to think, you write consistently in this article and in a lot of your work about how borders are changing as well. In particular, you just mentioned the nation state as an idea for organizing has been sort of superseded, and in this, you're tracking how capital itself, as many people are aware of, is eliminating borders and superseding them and moving past them. And I would just ask, in concluding, your prediction of where you think this process is heading with the creation of supranational bodies that include multiple capitalist countries within them, to think of something like the European Union, for example. Where do you see this heading in the progression of capitalism and its development, if this is a universal thing or if this is simply limited to European capitalist development?
You are aware of the fact that the question is not an easy one.
For sure, it's
I
quite
don't
a
like
difficult
predictions because predictions tend to be denied by facts.
Right, of course.
but I can say something, of course. First point is that in my work with Brett, we, particularly in Borderless Method, the first book we wrote together, we try to problematize a bit the idea that capital supersedes borders. We look at the ways in which capital transforms borders and in a way establishes also new borders while it uses existing borders. I think that today an important question, both for research and for politics, is precisely the kind of relationship and the kind of tensions between, let's put it in an easy way, political borders and borders that are created by capital, between political spaces and spaces of capital. Second point, I was mentioning before scholars like Giovanni Arrighi and Immanuel Wallerstein. And I remember when they started to speak about a crisis of the US hegemony at the global level. It was in the early 1990s. And to be honest, I thought they are funny guys. they don't read the newspapers and so on. Some 10, 15 years after, I had to change my mind. I changed my mind, and I started to take very seriously this idea, and particularly after the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, I started to reorient also my way to look at globalization following this hypothesis. And I would say that also the current war in Ukraine has this kind of relative decline, as its background. So in the last years, again, also working with Brett, we started to test the possibility of a reorganization of, let's say, the world order or the world market around regional blocks, regional and continental blocks. I think the war, the current war, in a way confirms this scenario, and it complicates it quite seriously. To be honest, I have no problem to say that. I never took seriously Russia in the last 15 years. What does it mean? It means that I never studied Russia. I was convinced that Russia was not going to play a really important role in the reorganization of the world market. And I don't know if you take the last book by Giovanni Arrighi, Adam Smith in Beijing, which is a great book, I think. Well, it doesn't speak of Russia either, So it was quite widespread. Now we are confronted with this war, that immediately raises the question of the world order. It's clear, that's the real question. Okay, Europe, Ukraine, Europe, but the scale of the war, at least the scale of the implications of the war, is global. And so we'll have to follow. I'm trying to write on the war. I try to recuperate a bit my ignorance about Russia, but okay, I could say that there are different scenarios today. That the relation between Russia and China is, of course, crucial. But there is a need to study, as Lenin was saying after the revolution, after the October Revolution. So maybe next time we can talk about this question in a more serious way.
Well, absolutely, and there's so much to be learned, as you said. And I would love to speak again sometime. I'll email you back, and perhaps we can chat more about it. Great. Well, thank you so much,
Came
Professor.
a couple of times to Cornell, maybe in the future.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, if you're ever here, just let us know. We'll have you speak for sure.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Ciao.
Bye.